combating so-called terrorist propaganda online. The world's largest 4 social media companies are joining forces to fight it. But should they be in a position to police content? And what will this mean for online privacy and freedom of expression? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Social media is everywhere these days. It's become an important part of our lives and the way we do things. It's used to galvanise protesters and drive elections. Now, some of the world's biggest social media companies want to battle against what they consider to be terrorist propaganda online. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Microsoft want to create a database to store what's called a digital fingerprint, which will flag content that's considered offensive or violent. And that includes recruitment videos for armed groups or gruesome imagery. The goal is that once one bit of content is removed by one company, others can quickly follow suit. We have a lot to get to with our guests, but first, Rob Reynolds sets up the discussion with this report from Los Angeles.
The internet has become the primary media outlet for violent groups, encouraging new recruits to go fight for ISIL in Iraq or Syria and influencing so-called lone wolf attackers in the US and Europe. The companies say by sharing information they can tag suspected troublemakers and bar them from creating multiple new accounts, as well as stopping problematic content that appears on one platform from reappearing on another. There is no place for content that promotes terrorism on our hosted consumer services. When alerted, we take swift action against this kind of content in accordance with our respective policies, the company said in a joint statement issued Monday. Governments have been urging the firms to do more to shut out such content, and at least one lawsuit related to the 2015 Paris attacks has been filed, seeking to hold Facebook, Twitter, and Google, which owns YouTube, partly responsible for the violence. But experts say once propaganda is posted on the web, it is almost impossible to get rid of it entirely.
Even years after Anwar al-Awlaki was killed in a drone strike on September 30th, 2011, his work is inspiring people years later.
Twitter says it has shut down 360,000 accounts linked to violent online groups. The companies also say they are determined to protect freedom of expression and members' privacy, a difficult digital needle to thread in an online era. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Los Angeles.
Well, let's bring in our guest now in Chicago, Robert Pape, director of the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism at the University of Chicago. In Malmö, Sweden, digital rights activist Aral Balkan, and in Washington, D.C., Jamil Jaffer, a former associate counsel to President George W. Bush. He now leads the Homeland and National Security Law Program at George Mason University. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Just to set the scene, I just want to get a 10-second answer from you about the fact that building a database to combat terror content seems like a really good idea on various media platforms, but is it? Let's start with you, Robert Pape in Chicago.
Yes, it will help, but it will only help on the margins in and of itself.
Aral Balkan in Malmö.
Well, I think we have to be very careful about what criteria we use to classify terrorist content. And I think that's going to be one of the key issues here, and who decides.
And we will be discussing that in more detail as we go along. Jamil Jaffer in Washington, your response to is it a good idea?
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a real opportunity by these companies to do the right thing and get ahead of a problem.
Doing the right thing is a really important, perhaps, element in this whole debate, because it's about doing the right thing for the global community, doing the right thing for countries and individuals, doing the right thing for social media, and doing the right thing for security. But then there is a level to which security is needed domestically. Robert Pape in Chicago, and one wonders whether, or where does security end and civil liberties remain without being impinged on?
There's no doubt that we have a real problem with video propaganda, particularly from ISIS. So in the last few years, ISIS has unleashed essentially a video revolution with its propaganda, and this matters tremendously to its ability to inspire. And how do we know? At the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism, we've just completed a 6-month study of the video habits of the 112 individuals who have been indicted for ISIS-related offenses over the last 2.5 years. 85% of those individuals watch ISIS videos. Many watch multiple kinds of ISIS videos. This does not mean that simply throwing technology at the problem is going to solve it completely. However, it does tell us that we have a real problem. It's a growing problem. Other groups are now beginning to follow suit, and we really have to engage with the serious rise of internet-inspired terrorism, mainly related to videos.
Okay, Jamil, Jaffer, you're nodding your head in agreement. I want to bring you in here from Washington, D.C., because one wonders, while the government, and you've been at the heart of government at one stage in your career, has such a wealth, for example, in the United States, of information and resources to call upon, what impact will these social media companies have on the much larger picture of offences that are deemed terrorism or whatever in that ilk of groups like ISIS?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think they have a tremendous impact. I mean, you know, the reality is today that a group like ISIS uses social media, as you've pointed out, both for recruitment and for propaganda purposes. And the real danger here in the West is the use of the tool for recruitment. And so a lot of, as Dr. Pape has pointed out, a lot of these people who we find have either gone to fight or have conducted attacks in the West are actually avid consumers of these terrorist videos, these propaganda videos. And so these social media companies, by taking them offline, can have a huge impact. Now, it's true that it's sort of a game of whack-a-mole because you're not going to be able to take out all the content all the time. That doesn't mean by taking them off the bulk of these core sites, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, by removing that content, you make it a lot harder to get to, and you get a lot less people attracted to it, and that solves a huge problem, I think. Dr. Pape is right. There's a lot more to be done, but this is a great first step in the right direction.
Aral, Balkan in Malmo, your position perhaps on this might be slightly different because we then have to talk really about civil liberties and the rights of the individual and how perhaps one person's terrorist is another man's hero. We're not talking about ISIS now, we're talking about in general terms, and how governments influence the type of individual or groups that they deem to be terrorists and how that could influence social media companies to get rid of material, whether it's a statement or a video, and maybe even have a go at opposition leaders.
Well, that's the thing. I think we can all agree that, you know, propaganda from ISIS is bad and, you know, we want to do something about it. But if we look at the technological means by which something like this is implemented, yeah, great. Today we're blocking ISIS videos, but we have the technological means to block anything. And again, that's where it really matters. What is the criteria? Is the criteria transparent? Or is it something that a handful of American companies, under the influence of the American government, decides on? And once these companies have built this functionality, it's not going to remain, you know, used just by the American government or by their criteria. Turkey and Erdogan are going to say, oh, great, so now we can remove anything we want from all of these platforms. We want you to classify this, this, and this as terrorist materials. So Erdogan's probably having a great day right now in Turkey, going, great, please build this. But this is a very convoluted, a very complicated problem because given the architecture of these platform monopolies, Google, Facebook, etc., there isn't much else they can do either. I mean, the monopolies themselves are the problem.
Well, don't you? Well, I was going to come in back on that, but I just saw that Robert was disagreeing with what you had to say.
Yeah, so I think there's a reasonable concern, but I think it could be taken way too far. The biggest threat to civil liberties is ignoring the terrorist threat altogether. And we can see that by what's happened in the United States in the last year as we've had terrorist attacks. What we are witnessing is millions of Americans willing to abandon many of their civil liberties and the civil liberties of other Americans in order to become secure from terrorism. So if we don't respond in a meaningful and serious way, there is a far greater risk to the civil liberties that we enjoy. Now, it is true, we have a lot of concerns. We have concerns about what counts as content. This isn't child pornography that we can readily see with just a computer app. This is a much more complicated problem. This means that we need to bring the best minds in America together, not just throw the problem over to Silicon Valley and say, hey, internet's part of the problem, you guys go solve it. No, this isn't going to work in and of itself, but it is a step in the right direction, and civil liberties concerns are crucial, but they should not stop this show.
Okay, I just want to pause just 1 second because I want to bring in the quote from Facebook here. They're actually saying that even as companies collaborate, that they'll maintain their individualism, and Facebook's statement actually says, each company will continue to apply its own policies and definitions of terrorist content, and each company will continue to apply its practice of transparency and review for any government requests. Throughout this collaboration, we are committed to protecting our users' privacy and their ability to express themselves freely and safely on our platforms. Aral, Balkan, you found that quite amusing, but I also want to throw at you as well, how much of this is about social media companies offering information, and should it be a more of a case that social media companies should be working in partnership with law enforcement agencies, because the impression we have is that it's all just going to be handed on a platter?
Well, I find it amusing because whenever I hear a company like Facebook or Google say that they care about their users' privacy, what they really mean is they care about eroding it, because their business model is based on them eroding people's privacy. That's how they make money, by tracking people, by storing their behavior, analyzing it and exploiting it. So, I mean, if we're talking about threats to civil liberties, let's also look at that aspect of it. The platforms themselves are a huge threat to our civil liberties and our freedoms. So, you know, should they work together with the governments? Well, no, I would not like to see them work together with the governments, but I don't think them having all this information about us and them being able to set the criteria for what is permissible and what is not, I don't think that is what we should be doing either. And what if they get it wrong? What if your account, because remember, this isn't just public information. Facebook knows where you live. So what if it thinks that you're uploading terrorist content and it gets it wrong and it flags you as because what it's doing there is it's flagging you as a terrorist as well, and it knows where you live.
Jamal
and
Jaffer,
knows where your family lives.
Yeah, Jamal Jaffer's nodding his head in disagreement with what you've just said.
Well, you know, I mean, I think that this concern that somehow, you know, these platforms are the problem, the reality is they're trying to do the right thing here. And by taking voluntary action, I think there's a real benefit here, because you don't get government regulations and things that are very kludgy in a technological environment. You get companies taking voluntary action, trying to solve the problem on their own. And look, you know, if Aral doesn't want to use Facebook or Google, that's fine. He's perfectly free to vote with his feet and use whatever platform he wants. And the notion that somehow these are monopolies, the fact that you've got companies like Microsoft,
but Jamal,
Google,
many of these companies,
Yahoo.
many of these companies, Jamal, and many of the individuals, millions of people across the world that use these companies are normally highlighting an issue, want to not so much promote terrorism, but say, look at what's happening in this country or in that country, and isn't this terrible? I think what Aral is saying, and what's been brought to my attention, is that individuals could be flagged up for just literally passing on information to educate others about what's going on in the world, and that is wrong.
I think it's a fair point, you know, if that's in fact how this ends up being used. But I think that what you've seen, in fact, to the contrary, is these companies have generally been more open to allowing people to communicate, and they've now determined that it's a problem with their policies and that they need to take a tougher stand on it. They're doing it as a voluntary measure. If they overcorrect, then certainly people like Aral and other groups will criticize and they'll step back. But as of right now, I think we ought to laud them for taking the right step, moving in the right direction. And in fact, if you look at their statement, they're very nuanced on what they say. They're focused on the most extreme, most aggressive forms of this stuff. We're talking about, you know, execution videos. We're talking about aggressive efforts to recruit individuals in the West to conduct attacks. There's always been an understanding, even in American law, which protects the freedom of speech very strongly, that there's a difference between freedom of speech and expression and incitement to violence. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about actual incitement to violence.
Robert, let me bring you in here. You wanted to come in.
Yes, I think we should recognize that a lot of the companies we're talking about have been doing classified work for the government for many, many, many years. And one of the important things about the step we're discussing is we're discussing it. This is transparent. This is happening out in the open. We can therefore voice concerns about civil liberties. We can then take some steps to try to institutionalize cautions, measures that can prevent or at least mitigate overreactions here and abuse. Does that make it perfect? No, but I'd far more rather be having this discussion transparently than I would, let's just bury all this in classified worlds, which is the way we've handled this for decades. And it's just it's a sign that we are actually making progress and trying to balance the threat of terrorism and the real concerns of civil liberties, but in a reasonable way.
Well, that's perhaps the perspective you might have from the US. Aral, can I bring you in here? Because in the UK, this year we've seen the Investigatory Powers Bill come through Parliament, basically the Snoopers Charter. There's been very little public antagonism towards that bill, but it affected you personally, and it's about the government being able to tap into records without you even knowing about it.
Yeah, and it's worse than that. I mean, just recently in the Register, there was an article about how it basically means that the government can lie in court cases. It means that any piece of communications technology that's built has to have a back door that the government can listen in on. This is why we left the UK and why we're based in Sweden now, because I'm building a peer-to-peer network that, you know, we can't build this into. It's just not possible for us to build this into, and that would be illegal under this. And yeah, there was almost no resistance to it, which is crazy. I mean, Tom Watson, who's a Labour MP, actually blocked me on Twitter for calling him out on it and asking him why why they're not taking a step against this, a stance against this. So yeah, this is a real concern.
Come in, Robert. Yes, you want to come in on that.
And the reason you're seeing that there's no resistance to this particular bill is because of the fear of terrorism.
But at the time, Robert, I'm going to come in very quickly. At the time that this bill was going through Parliament, we had a huge debate in the United Kingdom. I say we because I too am British. A huge debate on Brexit, which seemed to take the opinion and the attention of the whole country away from this particular bill, which was passed. I'm not going to say under the covers. It was passed quite clearly in Parliament, but it did not get the attention that it normally would have, because if you take a look at the people of the United Kingdom, they're quite concerned even about identity cards in the past that they didn't really want to have. That's another subject for another day. But the United Kingdom is just one country amongst many others.
I realize this may seem paradoxical, but it's what we have observed for since 9/11 over and over again. The more the public is truly concerned about the fear of terrorism, the more they sacrifice civil liberties. And so if we do not take steps to reduce the threat, then the threat to civil liberties is actually going to grow and grow tremendously.
Do you see how this is a catch-22? I mean, the fear of terrorism is also a very manufactured threat. You are more likely statistically to die from falling out of bed than you are from a terrorist attack. We have almost no evidence whatsoever that any sort of mass surveillance or any erosion of our liberties actually results in terrorists being caught. In fact, the thing that we do know is that police does.
I greatly respect John Mueller. He's a good friend of mine. The fact of the matter is, swimming pools don't try to come and kill you and plan to kill you. What we are seeing is terrorism work the way terrorism works, through fear. That fear is often irrational, it's often emotional, and trying to talk people out of an emotional fear is simply not going to work. And that's what we have witnessed. What we have witnessed is that there is no way to solve the emotional fear of terrorism except to reduce the number of terrorist incidents. And that's what we're engaged in with this particular effort. Is it perfect? Hardly is it perfect. But I would just simply submit that doing nothing here is going to make the civil liberties problem dramatically worse. And you've just seen this in the American election.
Robert, I'm just going to stop you there. I'm just going to pause for thought again, because I want to bring in another element which will help move the debate on very quickly. quickly, but where do you draw the line about what is offensive and what are just the facts on the ground? Now, in the past, Facebook has removed pictures of women breastfeeding because some subscribers were concerned about female nudity. And the site was criticised for temporarily blocking the iconic napalm girl, as you can see now, the picture from the Vietnam War, because of child nudity. Could the same image be regarded as pornographic? Big question mark there. Now, in terms of terror content, with more and more adults getting their news from social media, there's always been concerns that censoring violent footage, like this example of an ISIL beheading, could lead to a less informed public. Of course, we're not going to show that at all on Al Jazeera now or in the future. Jaffer, let me bring you in here. You were within President George W. Bush's inner circle during the time that terrorism really became so much more focused after the 9/11 attacks. What was the discussion about information gathering, and where was social media then in terms of helping gather that intel?
Well, you know, Sohail, the amount of social media coverage of terrorism and the use of it for recruitment is really something that's skyrocketed even post the Bush administration. I mean, that's the real change we've seen. While the internet was used by terrorists to conduct propaganda and to engage in media footage, it's not nearly as broad back then as it is today. And so we've got a whole new problem. And I think that Dr. Pape is exactly right, that if you're worried about the threat to privacy and civil liberties, what you want is private action. You want companies to take the action and not have the government legislate. You want them to be able to act because, you know, civil liberties groups and privacy groups can talk to the companies more directly than they can and be more successful with them than they can with the government. And so that conversation is happening. It's happened before and it's happening today, and but that's what you really want to see. And the notion somehow
it's been a difficult relationship.
That government efforts.
No, it's been a difficult relationship, though, hasn't it, between state and communications companies? Just the recent Californian case where they wanted to break into the iPhone of a married couple who'd shot many people. I mean, we saw the state versus a company, and that didn't sort of go too well, did it?
No, that's exactly right. And so, I mean, that's a great example. You know, Aral points out about sort of the monopolies and how bad they are. But the reality is that a lot of times they're actually protecting the civil liberties or seeking to protect the civil liberties of their users against the government. It's something I've actually criticized them for at times, in particular the San Bernardino case. But the reality is that they actually are oftentimes the biggest advocates for privacy and civil liberties, particularly when it comes to their users. And so, while there's no doubt that that the government is going to take steps to try and surveil terrorists, as they should, to protect the safety of their people, right? And the companies are going to remove content they believe is problematic. That's exactly how it goes. And, you know, it's funny, Sohail, you just mentioned that Al Jazeera would never show the beheading videos, but yet Aral is willing to criticize Twitter and Facebook for doing the exact same thing.
Let me just bring in Aral for a moment there, because we talked about what happened in the UK with yourself. The European Commission has been critical in recent days of the social media groups, saying they're not doing enough and in the right amount of time to get rid of offensive material on the internet. We're seeing Twitter increase its staff on its abuse reporting team and removing as many as 235 accounts. Social media really is taking a social action across the global community. So what can be wrong with that? And do you think, for example, the European Commission needs to push to make it more efficient, certainly on the European continent?
Well, look, with the system that we have today, we have to understand it. When we talk about Facebook or Google or Twitter, we're talking not about a public space. These are not public spaces. It's not like, we're not talking about a park. We're talking about shopping malls. So if our only places where we can express ourselves and have conversations and share ideas are shopping malls, then this is the only direction that this can go. Right? Of course, if ISIS comes in and sets up a booth inside of a shopping mall, then you have every right to say to that mall, do you agree with this? If you don't, get them out of there, and they have every right to do that. You have no free speech rights inside of shopping malls. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, should we be building an infrastructure, a digital infrastructure for the future, where we don't have any parks and we only have shopping malls in which to have conversations? So when you hear things like previously that these companies are protecting privacy, don't get that wrong. What you're mistaking is they're protecting their assets against the government. Your data is their asset, and that's what they're protecting when they fight the government. They're not protecting your privacy because they're the ones eroding your privacy to begin with.
Well, And therefore, the moment we have to leave. It's been an entirely informative conversation and very entertaining. To all of my guests, Robert Pape in Chicago, Jamil Jaffer in Washington, D.C. and Aral Balkan in Malmo. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. And of course, thank you for watching as well. You can continue to see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Now, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. I'm Sohail Rahman, and from all of the team, thanks very much for your time and your company.